You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from Lifeline, offering a holistic wellness approach focused on supporting American law enforcement, promoting resilience, safety, and survivability.
On today's episode of Lifeline, we're going to go back to winter of 2021 to take another look at the 2021 Destination Zero Conference and Awards. The conference was comprised of 6 sessions. Each session dealt with a specific topic on OSW initiatives, like cardiac wellness, suicide prevention, and officer traffic safety. Today's episode is going to cover Session 1, Cardiac Wellness and Proper Health Screenings for Law Enforcement, and it features panelists Dr. Benjamin Stone, the Chief Executive Officer of Sigma Tactical Wellness, and Dr. John Sheinberg, the Chief Medical Officer of Sigma Tactical Wellness. Doctors Stone and Sheinberg will discuss law enforcement-specific screenings that they hold, trends they're seeing around the country, and why law enforcement professionals are at a higher risk for cardiovascular disease than the general public. And now, Lifeline presents Session 1 of the 2021 Destination Zero Conference, Cardiac Wellness and Proper Health Screenings for Law Enforcement.
My name is Dr. Benjamin Stone. I'm the CEO of Sigma Tactical Wellness. I was working in Vail, Colorado at the time, and one of the commanders, Craig Bettis, came in and asked me if I could design a program specifically for cardiac wellness for law enforcement.
We know now, after many years of research and data, that this job has a tremendous effect on you physiologically. That led me down a path, and along that path I came across Dr. Stone in Sigma and what the work he was doing in Vail.
We worked with Vail, Colorado initially. We screened 34 officers. Since then, we've screened almost 5,000. And it's been a really amazing journey in the way this company has grown in terms of its reach and expansion. We first started with local law enforcement. We now work in federal, state, and local. We work with Vail, Colorados of the world, all the way up to the United States Secret Service. It is a very tailor-made, structured approach to preventing a very preventable illness from claiming unnecessary lives, and that is heart disease.
So we began at that time working together as a partnership where Sigma would start working with Vail Police. We were the first group, if you will, to go through, and since then it's obviously grown into a much larger nationwide effort that focuses primarily on cardiac and metabolic syndrome.
Sigma Tactical Wellness is a cardiac and metabolic screening program designed to identify heart disease in first responders before that heart disease creates problems such as heart attacks, strokes, and other cardiovascular conditions. The problem that we face is that the incidence and the prevalence of heart disease in law enforcement and in the fire service is substantially higher than what we see in the civilian sector. So we see heart attacks in cops occurring younger and more frequently than we see in the civilian sector. So for example, in law enforcement, the average age of a heart attack is 46. Where compared to the civilian sector, that's 67 years of age. There's a huge difference. Cops also have a life expectancy which is 22 years less than the general population. When Sigma Wellness engages within a police agency or a public service agency, we provide on-site cardiac screening. So we bring a team of a physician or a physician extender, an exercise physiologist, and a dietitian to the police department to go over the testing that we have performed. The testing that we do is state-of-the-art cardio and metabolic testing, and again, it is designed to identify the very early stages.
I think from an administrator standpoint, I see overall health and happiness come about through job satisfaction, performance, less sick usage, but the real benefit comes when they come knocking on my door and they say something like, this is the best thing I've ever had in my career.
As a cardiologist and as a police officer, I've been in a relatively unique position to try to make a difference in police officer mortality. In other words, how do I keep cops alive? My skill set as a doctor and as a cop is not running traffic. It's keeping my fellow officers alive and in uniform and on the street and making sure they have a long, healthy retirement.
The doctor, and I can't remember which doctor it was that gave the results back here at DFW Airport, but the first thing he said to me after looking over my blood test results and my EKG, and he said, "When was your last heart attack?" And I was at first I thought he was joking, and when I realized he wasn't joking, I said, "What do you mean I haven't had a heart attack?" And he kind of looked at me like he was more concerned than I was. I said, "What kind of surgery?" He said, "You're going to need bypass surgery." And I said, "How many?" And he said, "Well, at least 3. Turned out to be 4.
And I've seen too many cases and too many scenarios where young officers have died from heart disease after they've just participated in a citywide screening. And that's what Sigma has fixed. We've deployed something that is effective, that is incredibly precise and entirely individualistic, such that when someone goes through the program, they either leave knowing exactly what's wrong and exactly how to fix it, or they leave with a clean bill of health. But there's nowhere in between.
You know, where I hope to see Sigma go, the passion that I have for this project and for law enforcement in general, is that data in a few years is going to start to bring back that dial, right? What I want to see is law enforcement rates of cardiac death drop. So when they do decide to finish their career on their own time and go back and live and start their new life, that they have a long and healthy life to do that with.
I say it saved my life.
So much easier to prevent than react.
In my 22 years of law enforcement experience, this single-handedly has been the most important thing that I've been a part of in this industry.
Hi, my name is Dr. Benjamin Stone, and I'm the CEO of Sigma Tactical Wellness. And what I want to talk to you today has a lot to do with the #1 killer of law enforcement, and that's heart disease. And I've got some pretty compelling case studies, some pretty interesting statistics that I think will not only give you the understanding of really what the landscape is out there with respect to heart disease, but some of the things that police officers face that definitely increase risk to heart disease. And, you know, my background is pretty diverse. I did an MD PhD program at the University of Oxford through the Air Force Institute of Technology and got to work in a lot of really interesting frontiering fields and was sort of always on the cutting edge of physiology and medicine. And when I re-entered civilian life, you know, my primary goal was to find something I could really sink my teeth into and make an impact and help some good people. And I was actually working at Vail Health in Colorado at the time, and we had an issue involving a very young officer with the local police department there. And it was basically a 38-year-old male that had died of acute coronary disease. And I'm going to talk to you about what this means in just a couple of minutes. We're going to kind of dive into the science of this and really kind of get to the nuts and the bolts of what make police officers so susceptible to this illness. But it was very interesting, you know, in terms of the effect that it had on me, because I just thought, #1, this shouldn't happen for a 38-year-old fit athletic male. But #2, I thought, you know, there needs to be some screening measures in place here that can prevent these situations from happening. I mean, this person had, you know, a family, very young family, and his whole life ahead of him. And unfortunately, you know, he was suffering some circumstances that your typical municipal screenings involving like your basic lipid panels, et cetera. And we can talk about this stuff and what it means. They just don't undercover the underlying risk that you see that's typical for law enforcement officers. Now, this slide that I've got up here for you is really kind of where I like to start. And, you know, this is one of the first kind of anecdotal circumstances that we found that really kind of got a lot of attention. This is Charles Sincomani. He was a former chief at the DFW Airport in Dallas, Texas. And Charles is a 42-year veteran of law enforcement, super fit guy, incredibly nice, not stressed out, ate right, exercised, etc. And again, you're going to see a lot of this. This is sort of a recurrent theme amongst some of the case studies that we see. But, you know, he wasn't going to go through the program. And we ended up visiting with him prior to our blood draw. And I said, "Hey, Chief, you know, you brought us here on site for all your officers. Like, get your blood drawn, you know, just go through it, see what happens." And he was like, "You know, I walk my dog every day. I drink kale and avocado smoothie. I think I'm okay." And I said, I understand that, but I'm worried about what happened, let's say 25, 30 years ago, when you're living on what you can find at 2:00 in the morning at Maverick, and staying up 3 days in a row to cover shifts for your fellow officers. He's like, all right, I'll give it a shot. So we ends up going through the program. And one of our clinicians actually called our chief medical officer, Dr. Sheinberg, and said, hey, we've got a problem here with one of our patients. Very high calcium score. EKG was indicative of ischemia, and the labs weren't that great. And so we ended up making contact with this patient that wound up being Chief Cinquemani. And he said, this was, you can see the date stamp, this was in March. He said, I've got an appointment with my cardiologist like in November. And I'm just going to take this information and I'm going to give it to him, and, we can decide what we want to do with it. And, we were at Sigma, we were all like, it can't wait until November. Like, we need to get on top of this now. So we ended up going into the physician, I think his PCP initially, and referred him to a specialist like that week. And this is the email that we got about a week later. And I would love to say these circumstances are isolated and few and far between, but they're not. I would say we encounter the circumstance, maybe not quite as severe as this, but I would say we see it in 1 to 3% of our population. And that's basically in a group of 100 officers. We're going to find 1 to 3 individuals that are going to require specialty follow-up and potentially some surgical intervention. Okay. And, I understand that Chief Cinquemani was 62 years old at the time he went through the program, but I want you to understand something. Programs like this are not just for our veteran officers out there. They're not just for the old boys and the old girls in the room. Okay. This is, half of our at-risk population is less than 42. And when you think about what's going to happen over the course of the next 10 to 20 years, when these officers continue to ascend the chain of command, they're bringing with them a whole new era of cardiac sickness. And so this is something that we need to work with younger generations of police officers to really circumvent before they start to really absorb some of the significant stress on top of what they're already experiencing out there in terms of what they face as a line level police officer. Obesity is a big part of it. Nationwide, we look at about a 40 to 42% obesity rate amongst law enforcement, which is significant. It's 8% above the national average for civilians. I'm from the great state of Texas. The obesity rate is close to 80%, which is pretty shocking, to say the least. The most inflammatory condition linked to obesity is diabetes, and diabetes and cardiac disease are almost step for step with each other. And so, that's a big problem, pun intended. The saddest statistic for me is looking at the retirement and life expectancy upon retirement. We're looking at 18 months. Absolutely astonishing. 18 months to 5 years, 18 to 60 months is typically kind of what we see. And this is actuarial data coming from like the U.S. Department of Labor Pension Program. This isn't Joe's blog of policing. This is some pretty significantly studied information. I know you think, well, hey, listen, cancer, car wrecks, self-harm incidents, hunting accidents, whatever. There are other causes of death for law enforcement than cardiac. And I agree with you. But there was a study that was conducted, and I do believe it was a John Violante study, and I believe that's either published now or going to be published. But I believe he looked at police officer fatalities in 2018 to 2019, and 71% were cardiac in nature, and that's a big issue. You guys are 25 times more likely to die from a heart attack than you are from being shot, stabbed, or run over. And as unfortunate as that sounds, there's nothing that I can do about the latter, but there is a hell of a lot that we can do about the former, and that's what this program is designed to do. Life expectancy, 57 years for cops. That's astonishing. There's no reason that your life expectancy should be 22 years less than mine. And a lot of it has to do with the ages in which we start looking for heart disease in civilian populations, typically around age 45. We start doing some advanced diagnostics, looking for calcification, looking for abnormal EKGs, which by that point, that's the point at which insurance will kind of start picking up the tab for it. And we're going to talk about why in the next slide. But at that point, statistically, almost half of cops have had a heart attack by their 45th birthday. I'm 39 years old. The likelihood of me having a heart attack before my 50th birthday, based on my vitals, based on, my Framingham risk score, which again, we're going to discuss in the next slide, is like 1.6%. If I was a cop, it'd be closer to 50. And that is just absolutely unbelievable. There's another statistic here and not present that I think every decade of service either doubles or triples your risk for heart disease. And, I want you to understand something. And we've talked about point number one, we've kind of drilled that into the dirt, but I want to have you focus on points 2 and 3. one of the reasons why that we see this life expectancy here at 57 and such a high risk of heart disease leading to significant events that can be life-shortening events in law enforcement is due to the fact that you guys start developing heart disease at ages much earlier than we see in civilians. We typically don't start looking for calcium, as I said, 35, 45. And we work all over the country, and every time we write a calcium score on a young officer in a new area, we always get a call from a radiologist like, why are you writing a calcium score for a 35-year-old fit male? And our answer every time is because they're cops. You don't understand. In the areas in which we commonly work, we don't get those phone calls anymore. As you can imagine, they are very shocked at what they find, especially in our younger populations, things we just don't see until later on in life in civilians. And then number 3, and this is really where Sigma has kind of picked up the torch to run with, is that law enforcement officers develop heart disease absent of clinical markers normally associated with cardiovascular disease. And I think the chief reason among them is stress. And this is something that my counterpart, Dr. Sheinberg, goes into a lot more detail. I don't have that time, unfortunately, but he has a presentation that really sort of drills down on the reasons why. I want to talk about some of the things that we see and then really get into the medicine of what's going on a pathophysiological level so that everyone is on the same page with how the risk affects you and not sort of what are the causative factors underlying this issue. But cholesterol is a major issue here. And it's something that we've seen commonly as part of municipal physicals. And now I'm going to tell you this right now, cholesterol is almost irrelevant with respect to heart disease risk. Now, we've all probably heard of Framingham risk analyses. Maybe you haven't, but a Framingham risk score is sort of an arbitrary unitless number that's assigned based on the factors that you see on the left-hand side of your screen. Age is pretty heavily weighted, right? So gender also, we typically see this affecting more men than women. Cholesterol, naturally high LDL, that's factored into it. And of course, blood pressure, endocrinology, where you're diabetic or not, ethnicity, and of course, whether or not you're a smoker or drinker, or you're abusing other stimulants like caffeine, which is pretty common in law enforcement. And we sort of add those things together and we assign you a score. Now, here's the problem. If your score is not high enough, you don't merit additional diagnostic scrutiny, which means that, for instance, I'll give you an example. Look at this guy. All right. This is a 53-year-old male, one of our Colorado agencies. Okay. And he's given me permission to share his data here, but look at his labs. His labs are great. Every doctor he's ever gone to, especially at municipal level, has said, hey man, you're fine. Get out of here. He's skinny. He's actually a long course triathlete. So I don't know if you know what long course triathlon is, like full distance Ironmans. It's a 2.4 mile swim, followed by a 115 mile bike, followed by a marathon. Even for a really fit individual, it's a 10-hour event, so there is a prerequisite level of fitness that you have to have just to show up, and Jack certainly has it. Again, 33 years behind the badge. He's a lieutenant, one of the nicest guys I ever met in my life. And his wife's a vegan dietitian. He doesn't smoke or drink. His diet's great. His body comp's like 6%. And so when he shows up, after having a basic lipid panel, his docs are like, yeah, you're fine, man. Get out of here. You're not at risk. Now, the thing I want you to look at here is this number at the top of the page. Okay. And if you can see my cursor here, I'm circling it right now. That is called PLA2 activity. And that's something that most of you have probably never heard of before. PLA2, and there are others, oxidized LDL, myeloperoxidase, that's more of a genetic marker, but they're looking at cardiac inflammation and things specific to the onset of plaque within the coronary vasculature, okay? And I want you to kind of think about this for a moment because Jack's never had that number pulled. He's never had that lab drawn. He didn't qualify for it. His lipids are great. He's not that old. He has no bad habits. And unfortunately, it's just every time he's wanted more advanced screening, his doc's like, listen, I would love to do this for you. But the problem is your insurance company is going to deem this as medically unnecessary and you may get a big bill for it. And he's like, well, I don't want to do it if you don't think it's necessary. And he's like, well, your Framingham risk score is actually quite low, not understanding all of the other things that he absorbs as a law enforcement officer. And that's a big omission. And that's why we call this a case of mistaken identity, because here's the counterpart, okay? This is Derek, and I think he's in the same department, similar age. I think he's been a cop for 29 years, lieutenant. Phenomenally funny person. I mean, Derek lives on a diet, native Texan. Derek lives on a diet of Cuban cigars and barbecue and bourbon. And he's probably one of the happiest people I've ever met. I won't go into that, but obviously, all joking aside, he's unhealthy. He's 65 pounds overweight. He's a borderline diabetic. He's got 3 forms of metabolic disease and his cholesterol is terrible. I mean, look at this. His triglycerides are 5.5 times higher than they should be. And he's got some problems. Now, the thing I want you to notice that's different about Derek is it's different about Jack is look at that number. Look at that PLA2 activity. It's in the green. Okay. And just to give you an understanding of the references, I mean, I live this stuff. This isn't just a vocation for me. I mean, this is a lifestyle, and that's just about what my PLA2 activity is. Okay. And I'm 39 years old, and I like to think I'm fairly fit, low body composition. And, and this is not something that we would have expected. Derek's the guy that's like, everyone's betting. He's a pretty funny dude, got a great sense of humor, like most cops do. And he's like, the one that everyone's like betting on is going to be in the back of an ambulance at the end of the screening, and of course, he's making jokes at his expense, et cetera. But I want to really show you kind of what's going on here. And so I want to share a screen with you. It's kind of a whiteboard and I'm going to draw some pictures here. Just kind of go with me. So here's kind of what's going on. I know you didn't sign up for a science lesson here, but just kind of indulge me. Okay. So this is a cross section of a coronary vessel. Okay. And we have to keep these squeaky clean because they feed the heart, right? On the inside of that vessel, there's a little thin layer of tissue. Okay. And we call that vascular endothelium or endothelial lining or whatever you want to call it. But its job is very similar to what we'd see on like a skillet with respect to Teflon. This stuff is Teflon and it's got one job, and that's to keep stuff from sticking. And if it stays intact, then you don't have to worry about anything, right? Nothing is going to stick. There's nowhere for it to accumulate. Now, with law enforcement, because of the stress, especially the high amplitude sort of cortisol release stress patterns that are common in law enforcement officers, the lack of sleep, the high fructose diet, stimulant abuse, I'm talking caffeine especially, smoking, drinking, other coping mechanisms that aren't exactly positive in nature. What happens is we start to see a gradual wearing away of that Teflon layer on the inside of that vessel. And that's a big problem because now, guess what? Stuff starts sticking. Now, here's something I want you to understand is that you've always been told you keep your cholesterol low and you have low risk of atherosclerosis. And atherosclerosis is, of course, plaque development on the inside of a vessel. Keep the cholesterol low, you're out of the woods. That is not the case at all. Okay. And here's, if you take away nothing from this lecture, I want you to understand this. And that is plaque development is not a product of cholesterol or high cholesterol or low cholesterol. If the conditions are right, you will produce plaque irrespective of what your cholesterol is. So if you've got inflammation on the inside of that coronary vessel, where that endothelial lining has been gradually eroded and inflamed, what will start happening is it will start hosting plaque in and around and below that endothelial lamina. And that's a big problem because that's my cop killer right there, because this is unstable, vulnerable plaque. And we typically see this happening in younger officers, because if you go chasing somebody down, if you're working out in the gym, if you're playing with your kids in the backyard or your dog or something, and a chunk of that goes flying off downstream, that's acute coronary event. That's what killed that officer in Vail, Colorado. And we commonly see this happening in younger populations of officers. And it can happen without warning. There's no smoking gun test for plaque. So your municipal screening is going to miss this. There's no way they could possibly diagnose this soft plaque development without more comprehensive laboratory screening that we see within our physical. And so you can be commonly misdiagnosed. And I've got some pretty interesting data here I want to show you just after these case studies that proves that point to the nth degree. So this is bad. And this is something that your body sees as a threat. And so what it does is it starts putting a layer of calcium over the top of that plaque to sort of cement that plaque into place. And that's good, right? Because now that plaque is stable. It's not prone to rupture. But the problem is now is you have calcium in a coronary vessel. And the last time I checked, that's textbook heart disease. And the problem with that calcium development, that process, is that it's not finite. it sort of, once you start doing it, your body kind of doesn't know when to quit. And so it just keeps on getting higher and higher and higher until such point you have actually a mechanical obstruction that is preventing blood flow through that vessel. And that's where you can get some chest pains, angina, you can get numbness and tingling radiating down the arms and tunnel vision, etc. You have some symptoms that something's not right. Okay. Now, whether you pay attention to those symptoms is kind of up to you. And we commonly see law enforcement officers making excuses for that and in states of denial that we just don't see in civilian populations. Anyway, point I'm trying to make is that everything boils down to whether or not you have these pockets of inflammation. How do we know? Okay, how do we know? Well, that enzyme that you saw that was high in Jack and low in Derek. Derek's the guy that was living it up, right? Barbecue and smoking cigars and living the dream, right? So that enzyme is specific to that endothelial lining, okay? And that enzyme, if you remember, is called PLA2. And so if we see a lot of this stuff in your blood, then we can naturally assume that rates of inflammation are high. And there's a whole lot of places that plaque can develop. We expect to see or expect to find a lot of these little lesions along the longitudinal axis of that coronary vessel. And that's where plaque development and subsequent calcification becomes a problem. If your PLA2 is low or otherwise normal, right, then we can conclude that little endothelial lamina is intact and healthy, and you're kind of out of the woods for heart disease, at least, okay? At least at that point, okay? So I'm gonna go back to the presentation here. But again, I wanna remind you of kind of what we're seeing here. This guy, Derek, right? Horrible cholesterol, bad habits, low PLA2, okay? Whereas Jack, great cholesterol, great habits, high PLA2, and here's the problem. I don't know how long that's been elevated. I mean, maybe it's been like that for 2 weeks. Maybe it's been like that for 20 years. I mean, we have no way of knowing. So we do a calcium score. And what the calcium score will show us is the level, the location, and the extent of calcification. Now, calcium score 0 is ideal. That means there's no calcium. Anything but 0, and we have to treat that, okay? And typically, but not always, higher scores indicate a higher level of risk. But again, that's not always the case. It's better to have a 0 score, okay? So basically, this is kind of what a calcium score would look like. We look for these little flecks of calcium in that coronary vasculature, okay? And you can get this done in any local imaging facility in your town. It ranges between $45 and $500. I mean, it's very geographically diverse in terms of cost. And so you typically can always talk them down off that. We typically negotiate a rate somewhere between $95 and $125 for our COBs. It's cash pay. An HSA or an FSA will cover it. It's a very important piece of information, especially used in proxy with a lab and an EKG. So we do a calcium score on Jack. We find out Jack's got a calcium score of 1329. Now, he was as surprised as I was. And he looked at me and he's like, I don't get it. I do everything right. I eat right, I exercise, I don't smoke, I don't drink, I get plenty of sleep, I try not to be stressed out. I don't understand. And I'm like, Jack, let me ask you something. Has anyone in your family had heart disease or died mysteriously, single car accidents, et cetera, et cetera? And he looked at me and he was like, man, everyone in my family has died of heart disease at like age 42. And I'm like, dude, you have a positive family history, and there's nothing you could have done about this up until this point. There's no amount of kale that you could have eaten. There's no amount of exercise that would have prevented this. This is something that was going to happen. Now, we could have detected it earlier until it got to this point. But see, the thing that scares me about this is the guy that dies at age 57 from a heart attack, and no one sees it coming. Everyone's like, Jack was so fit, he's so healthy, like he was exercised, like, you know, he was living right. And again, I wish I could say these circumstances are anecdotal, and we just don't see them that way. It's very common. So, you know, actually Jack ended up going to a cardiologist, and they ended up examining him angiographically and found that he had no significant blockages. His EKG did not indicate ischemia at all. Okay. So it's not like he had to run to the ER, you know, for fear he was going to have a heart attack. That wasn't the case, but we obviously escalated his follow-up up to the specialty level. We got his PCP involved, wrote him a referral, and which minimized his out-of-pocket expense, minimized his copay, and we were able to get him some intervention. And he's going to be fine. He's going to be on medication for the rest of his life, but he's not going to die at age 57 from heart disease, and it all came down to that inflammation. It was a product potentially of his family history. But I can tell you right now, when you take a civilian that's got, a genetic predisposition to heart disease, to plaque development, and you put them behind a badge, it's like pouring water on a grease fire. And we see this with regularity. Where's my buddy Derek, that's living it up? Calcium score 0. And I actually remember him coming through the program. Like I say, he's a pretty funny dude. And he looked at me and goes, "Hey, doc, did you hear my calcium score 0?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I heard." He was like, "That means I don't have to change anything." And I'm like, "No, it doesn't." I was like, "Dude, you're 70 pounds overweight." In Texas, we have a saying is that you cast a little bit too much shade on the beach, And I said, "You got some problems, man. Your insulin's through the roof. You're borderline diabetic. We gotta fix some stuff, And so we ended up putting him on a weight loss plan. He ended up losing like 50 or 60 pounds, and ended up getting off of like 2 of his 5 medications, which is great, And I think he still looks awesome. So bottom line is we just don't see law enforcement officers following the same trends and medical diagnostics with respect to heart disease that we see in civilians, and it's interesting. And this is a pretty compelling piece of information. We're actually in the process of publishing this next month, hopefully, in the Journal of College Cardiologists. But this is a cohort of 1,200 cops that we looked at. And this is all ages, both genders, across the United States. So this isn't one geographical area. This isn't, us focusing on one group of officers in Southern Texas where obesity is through the roof and heart disease is just rampant, right? This is a pretty wide swath of officers from Bend, Oregon, all the way to Washington, D.C. And what we found was interesting. Now, we had 400 of the 1,200, 402 to be exact, that had abnormal LDL. Okay, so they would have an elevated Framingham risk score such that they would qualify for additional diagnostic scrutiny. So we kind of took that group and we pushed them aside. We're like, look, you guys are going to get intervened upon. I want to know what's going on with this other 800 group of 800 officers here that have normal cholesterol. So we looked into it and we started drawing some cardioinflammatory lipids. We looked at PLA2, we looked at oxidized LDL, myeloperoxidase in certain cases, and we found that group of 800 officers, 126 of them were walking around with active plaque. 16% had no idea, that had passed their municipal physical with flying colors, no issues at all, had been told, "Don't worry, you're at low risk for heart attack." And a lot of these people were young. I know a lot of these people, I don't have the statistic, but it's like almost half, which is kind of what we see, were the ones that had active plaque, non-calcified. So there's still some chance here that we can correct this. But the first thing we have to do is find them. And that's unfortunately not something that we're seeing being done at the municipal level. It's creating a lot of false negatives and a lot of false positives. And so it's pretty interesting data for sure. This is an interesting statistic as well that we found in our cohort, and that is female officers are 8 times more likely to have a 0 calcium score, right, than males. And I think we really don't know why. Personally, I think it's just general decision-making. It's probably a lot better in, female populations writ large than it is in male, but it's pretty interesting statistic to say the least. And I can tell you just based on what we've seen, I can echo that, in terms of significance. These are the diagnostics that we use. And I'm going to tell you right now, ladies and gentlemen, this is not smoke and mirrors. This is not rubbing crystals together. This is stuff in some cases we've been doing for 100 years, especially with EKGs. The way we use these diagnostics together gives us a lot of predictive ability and allows us to really assess cardiac risk from an actual perspective and not theoretical. We take our lipid panel, which includes those cardioinflammatory biomarkers we talked about, like PLA2 and ox-LDL, and we cross-reference that with a calcium score. And the really cool thing about it is, let's just say that your calcium score is really high and your labs are indicating plaque, and you're like, "Oh my God, I've got to run to the ER." That may not be the case. If you're not symptomatic and we don't see an EKG that's indicative of ischemia, we're going to work with your PCP and maybe even write you a specialty referral, but it's not something to where you have to go run screaming to the hospital, out of fear and coercion. that you're going to drop dead of a heart attack. And so we really try to work with you to help you understand where your risk is and what steps are most impactful in making a positive and solid intervention strategy. Okay. It's not always about fear. And I'm going to tell you something else. It's not always about medication and triple bypasses and angioplasty. In a lot of cases, it's a visit with a treadmill. It's a change in diet. Maybe it's an additive of maybe like 2,000 or 4,000 milligrams omega-3. I mean, it's not always about going to a pharmacy and getting a prescription refilled. And that's the other part of this program that I want you to understand is there is a large lifestyle change component to this. I mean, you sit down with 20 minutes of FaceTime with an exercise physiologist / dietitian, and they're going to sit there and explain things to you. And maybe it's some things that you're doing that you shouldn't, you know, and we try to work with you to help you understand. We're not going to lecture you and treat you like a child, but we're going to help you understand, hey, here's what's going on. Here's why it's happening. And here's what's going to continue if you don't make some changes. And I'll tell you, cops are so processorial and type A and strategic that if we can just lay that information out there, they almost always make the right decision. You know, it's really remarkable. It's a great group of people to work with. Now I'm going to kind of skip some slides here. I had some case studies of pretty terrible EKGs. This is some of the stuff that we see. I mean, it's pretty nuts. This is someone who had a cholesterol of 3,000, which is pretty high. Right? That's pretty serious abnormalities, some of which is hepatic in nature. This was a 26-year-old with a calcium score of 1256, which is a medical anomaly, something that you never see in civilian healthcare. And, we asked this young man, about his family history. And he's like, man, I'm adopted. I don't have a clue. And we're like, oh my God, just goes to show you that you can't leave any stone unturned. This was an interesting circumstance. This is a 24-year-old fit male in one of our Colorado agencies. Myeloid leukemia. We caught it so early, he's got like a 99% chance of survival. He's in remission on a 6-month follow-up with an oncologist. But the thing about this was really amazing, is that, he had no idea. 2 weeks prior, had gone through his municipal physical. Lipids were fine, no other issues, nothing that would indicate any kind of problem like this. He was told he was perfectly healthy. And he was actually not going to participate. And one of his field training officers was like, no, you're doing this because you need a baseline at age 24 that you can stand on. And you can use this to assess your health as you continue to promote and progress through this career. Thank God for that officer, because if this young man had not gone through the program, I can tell you the outcome would not have been positive. But I put this out there because I don't want you to think that this is all about cardiac health. I mean, granted, it's the #1 killer of active and retired law enforcement officers, but this blood draw is so comprehensive. I mean, we catch all kinds of stuff. I mean, we diagnose polycystic ovarian syndrome in women, prostate issues in men, leukemia, heart disease, obviously. We've even seen granulomas in the lungs based on the results of the calcium score. And so it's probably one of the most comprehensive physicals you're going to get, unless, you're in the hospital and we're looking for something. And so there's a lot to be gained from this. Even if you're pretty sure that you've got low risk for heart disease, there's some other things in here that can definitely open your eyes to some events that could be potentially life-shortening. So again, we'll keep moving here. So obviously, here's the reasons why. I tend to gloss over this stuff because it's obviously, this is, everyone knows this stuff. But the thing that I really want to try to bring your attention to is number 4, and that's the retirement issue. In Austin, Texas, not 3 weeks ago, we had an officer age 51 who had retired in July of last year, died of a heart attack. It was her 3rd heart attack death this month. And I just think to myself, my goodness, that could have been prevented, had programs like this been in place. And it's just incredible what we see. And you just don't see this. And I mean, through the Air Force, I've worked with some pretty high risk occupations, but I've never seen one occupation that is so susceptible to one disease like cops are to heart disease. And we're doing something about it. This is the way the program is put together. Pretty simple. I mean, this is our program. It seems to work. Everything that we do minus the calcium score is done on site. If you want to mirror something like this in your department, let me know how I can help you. We tend to work with agencies that are less than, say, 1,000 police officers, just because they typically don't have external relationships with healthcare facilities and physicians. Your larger metro agencies seem to. And so if you have the innate and inbuilt infrastructure to support a program like this, I'm happy to talk with you about how it looks and, kind of how our program works and, how you can build one, with your own resources. But for everyone else, this seems to work really well. First stop's a blood draw. We actually fly a phlebotomist in from our partner, Cleveland Heart Lab. And they set up in a conference room and an unused office with some privacy, and they draw blood. And it's super simple. The only thing bad about it is built on a 6 or an 8 hour fast. Can't drink coffee. Well, I guess you can if you don't put anything in it. Can't eat, right? No calories of any kind. Obviously, that can have an effect on the results, but it's a 5-minute deal. You walk in, get your arm stuck, and you're out. We send the blood result, we send the samples. So we send the samples off that day, overnighted, and we start getting results back in about 3 weeks. And in that period of time, it's your responsibility to go and get that calcium score done. It's your homework. You have 3 weeks to do it. It takes no time at all. It's a 15-minute assessment. You spend more time actually filling out the intake form at the imaging facility than you do in the machine that, connects or collects that information. Once you're back on site with us, we typically bring our entire team back within about 3 weeks. Okay. And our first stop is with an intake nurse, and he or she is going to do a lot of things. It's a basic intake. We do vitals, we do surgeries, hospitalizations, medications, family history. We get to know you as a patient a little bit. And we build you an EMR, an electronic medical record, which is extremely important, especially if you need follow-up with an external physician, because we can sync our EMR with theirs, and we can shoot all this information right over the top of your head with your authorization to your PCP or specialist. You don't have to handle anything. We take care of all that on your behalf. Once you're done with that intake and you're hooked up to the EKG leads, we transition you over into a cardiometabolic stress test. And what that cardiometabolic stress test does, it does a lot of things. Obviously, an EKG, everyone knows what an EKG does, right? We're looking for any untoward electrical abnormalities in the heart, some of which could indicate ischemia or blockages, right? Some of which may be potentially arithmetic, conditions that you inherit from mom and dad and you don't know anything about, and that's always pretty enlightening. And it's just a phenomenal corollary to the other diagnostics that we collect. The other part of it is cardiometabolic in nature. Now, I know that may not mean anything to you, but there's probably a lot of people watching this that use Fitbits and activity trackers, and that's cool because it creates accountability, of how many calories you're burning every day. But here's the thing that I want you to understand. I don't really care about calories burned. I care about where those calories are coming from, because the human body is kind of like a car that could operate on diesel and gas, right? We have two forms of fuel. We have fat, we have carbohydrate. Car only has one. Now, the way we use those fuels, obviously you want to be more fat dependent, especially if your goal is weight reduction. But the way we use those fuels is largely a product of diet and exercise. And the information that we glean is extraordinarily compelling, because I want to maximize fat utilization. And I can go on tangents for hours. I could literally teach 2 semesters of a graduate level course on that one statement. There's so much going on behind the scenes physiologically that can have an effect on fat utilization and carbohydrate utilization in law enforcement officers. And so what you're going to do is you're going to take that information, you're going to transition into a consult with an exercise physiologist / dietitian, and they're going to break down that data. They're going to talk about diet. They're going to bring in the component of exercise, especially exercise intensity, which is a really interesting conversation, very mind-blowing. We actually sent out a survey after this is over, and I think like 72% of people said that the diagnostics with respect to the not cardiac, but the cardiometabolic component of, kind of diet and exercise and fat and carb utilization was the most compelling part about the entire visit, which is crazy for me because, I think the diagnostics on the cardiac side are incredible. They're cutting edge state of the art stuff that you can't get really anywhere else. And, but anyway, but I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that information, you can leave that consultation and immediately go to work, immediately start making changes that you're going to see on the scale manifesting like the next day or two. It's really incredible. Anyway, that's a really unique opportunity to kind of ask some questions, to set some goals, and then you're going to leave with a diet to follow that's 2 weeks long. And by the way, if you want more, we send it to you. There's no charge for that. We don't charge for follow-up, just FYI. Now, I don't believe that's a great way of doing business anyway. Next and last step is sitting down with a doctor, a nurse practitioner, or a PA. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about labs. We're going to talk about calcium scores. We're going to talk about EKGs and how all those things work together to establish a follow-up plan and a care plan. Okay. Once we're finished, we're going to tie everything up into a nice, neat little bundle, and we're going to send it to you. Okay. Now, here's the thing. In a lot of cases, it does require follow-up with a physician. If you don't have one, we can help you with that. We can find one in your insurance network. We can work with you just to make sure that you're followed up upon, okay? Especially if the situation is untoward, okay? But I want you to understand something. If you're participating through a municipality, we don't send this to anyone else but you. This is HIPAA-protected, private healthcare information. And we don't want any HIPAA violations because it's a pretty steep and lofty penalty, okay? And so I want you to understand something. This is not something we share with chiefs. It's not something we share with human resources executives. This is very private information that does not impact your career, either positive or negative. It's an investment in your health. And I can tell you personally, this is the most satisfying experience I've ever had, whether it be in clinical medicine or healthcare writ large. It is so enjoyable working with law enforcement. We do some work with fire as well, but we developed this program for cops, and we make no bones about that. And so for us, this is something we want to keep doing. Our goal is to get a large number of officers through this program and go to the Department of Justice, go to a large funding body, or maybe even a corporate, organization that is capable of funding this at a much larger level. And at the end of the day, our number one goal is longevity. We want to change those statistics. We want to extend retirement. We want you to bleed the pension system dry, and most of all, we want to make it such that when you come home, you have more energy to spend with your spouse or engage in a hobby or special interest, or maybe when you're on the clock, we want your interactions with society to be more pleasant and just make this experience and this career in law enforcement as enjoyable as possible. That is it, ladies and gentlemen. I've really tried to condense that as much as I can. There's some heavy information. My information is on bottom. Dr. Jonathan Sheinberg, board certified cardiologist and police officers, our chief medical officer, one of the most brilliant and gifted doctors I've had the experience of working with. He has a wealth of information. I don't practice medicine. I'm specifically focused on running this organization and getting you the highest quality medical care that I can. And so if there's any questions that pertain to anything that I discussed, get in touch with me. We'll set up a meeting and we'll discuss it. I want to thank you so much for the opportunity. I want to thank Destination Zero for doing what they're doing and addressing the number one killer of law enforcement, and that's heart disease. Thank you again for your attention, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of Lifeline, where we revisited Session 1 of the 2021 Destination Zero Conference, titled Cardiac Wellness and Proper Health Screenings for Law Enforcement. Check out our other episodes of Lifeline and even more content from Precinct 444 wherever you find your podcast. And as always, thank you to Christopher Mitchell, the museum's manager of digital content and strategy, for producing. And many thanks to you for listening to this episode of Lifeline, a Precinct 444 podcast from the National Law Enforcement Museum. We hope you'll join us again at the precinct.
Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.